I think it's important and absolutely critical to talk about the root causes of the economic crisis, which began in 2007, 2008. Why is that important? I think it should be obvious, but I'll say it. Because if we don't identify the primary cause, then all of the solutions that are being proposed will be for naught. They will not be effective because we have not identified the problem. We'll believe, in fact, we're solving the problem when we're not even addressing it. And then we'll offer great proposals when in reality we're not even close. And that system, of course, is really existing capitalism, not the capitalism taught in economics departments or the capitalism that is described on the evening news or on Morning Edition or All Things Considered or the Charlie Rose Hour or the News Hour on PBS. That kind of capitalism is a fantasy. What we have today is state capitalism, where corporations are heavily subsidized and supported by the state. There's a word for that. It's a kind of perverted socialism. So we saw that, of course, when different corporations are going under the state. That means us, we the taxpayers, like Goldman Sachs, like Bear Stearns, like Citicorp, like Wells Fargo, like JP Morgan Chase, like Bank of America. So there is a kind of weird, really existing capitalism here in the US, not this kind of mystical thing of the invisible hand. When people quote Adam Smith, who have never read Wealth of Nations, who was in fact very critical of the rapacious nature of the merchants of the day, as he called them, in England. And he was particularly critical of the British looting of the Indian subcontinent, and wrote about it very, very eloquently. Now this crisis begins, this current economic phase of capitalism, really begins, as Wolff points out, in the 70s and 80s. What happens in the 70s and 80s? Wages go stagnant. For the first time since 1820, basically, wages of American workers were on a steady increase. In the mid-70s and late 70s, and certainly in the 80s, wages go flat. Corporations discover a couple of things. With their political allies in Washington, they can smash the unions. The union movement has always been a thorn in the side of capitalism. Why? Because workers are organized and make demands for better working conditions, for better pay, for to have a decent life, to have such things. Maybe some of you have heard of them if you're old enough: pensions, health care. No, nobody's old enough here. Paid vacations, paid sick leave, things like that, are all now increasingly distant memories. And so there was a huge political attack on unions, and it's been very successful, sadly. At one point, union membership in this country, private sector, it's in the single digits. And in the public sector, it's just a little bit beyond 10 or 11%. That's had a profound impact on everyone. Maybe a few Silicon Valley gazillionaires aside, Facebook and Microsoft and those things, but that's not the steady decrease in wages. So the corporations and the banks figure out, okay, you don't have much money, but why don't I make credit cards available to you? Free and easy. And there wasn't a day, I don't know if you remember at that time, offering, free credit, just sign up. I don't have any money. I don't even have a job. It doesn't matter. Just sign, you can have a credit card. And so this begins this whole other economy of credit. And corporations at this time also discover another little mechanism called outsourcing. they figured out, why should we pay these pampered, that was the word that I think Reagan used, pampered American workers, why should we pay them, why should we pay their health care and vacations and pensions and all of these things when I can just move my whole operation to Bangladesh or to Vietnam or to the Philippines and make an absolute killing? And this was enabled by political legislation passed in Congress, and it became a huge bonanza for the corporations. So that has been a very, I think, debilitating aspect of what's happened to the American economy. If you just go back to 2007, 2008, you know that there was a panic. The roots of this go much deeper than 2007 and 2008. And the corporations at this time saw their profits going through the ceiling. Huge increase. This is also when there's an enormous separation, as Wolff points out in the book, between the pay of the average worker and the average CEO. It used to be 4-to-1, 7-to-1, somewhere in that range. All of a sudden, in the 80s, it takes off into 200-to-1, 300-to-1, 400-to-1. So you had these huge disparities now between the elite management class and the workers, who were left scrambling in the new economy, where a lot of the well-paying union jobs disappeared and other jobs went to factories in East Asia and Southeast Asia. Now, bankers brought the world's economy to the brink of collapse, and then, as the Occupy slogan says, we got sold out, they got bailed out. We have a lot to thank the Occupy people for, in that, you know, they injected the idea of income and wealth inequality into the U.S. political discourse. I think it's also important to make a distinction between income inequality and wealth inequality, because those are two different things. And there, the disparity has just become as wide as the oceans. Income inequality is simply what you earn, your wage. So you make $40,000, I make 50, you make 70. That's what we earn. Wealth inequality is completely different. That's your membership in the San Jose Golf Club. That's your yacht club and your yacht club membership. It's your home in Aspen. It's your apartment in Paris. It's your condo in New York. It's your hedge funds. It's your stocks. It's your private equity funds. This constitutes wealth, which is very different from income inequality. That has absolutely gone soaring into the imperium, beyond any kind of Gilded Age level or anything else unprecedented in U.S. history. And today we have a situation where, like that well-known substance, capitalism has hit the fan. There seems to be a crisis in capitalism. And the remedies that are being proposed are simply stopgap measures that will not be successful. Why? And Wolff talks about this again in the book. The people who are writing the reform legislation, in fact, who wrote Dodd-Frank and other regulatory mechanisms, are in fact the very people who stand to gain from more of this kind of chicanery that we've witnessed over the last 6 or 7 years. There's a very good article by Matt Taibbi in Rolling Stone about how the Dodd-Frank bill, this is this great regulatory bill that's supposed to protect us and replace the bill that Clinton repealed in 1999, the Glass-Steagall Act, which was something from FDR's period. And he shows very clearly that all the teeth have been taken out of Dodd-Frank. So this shouldn't surprise you when the system is trying to save itself and is creating these kinds of palliatives to kind of soothe, your anxiety. Oh, we're on top of it, our representatives in Congress. Are they taking any corporate money? Do they get money from the banks? Of course they do. Are actually looking out for us. It's almost a contradiction in terms. How can you have the wolf in the hen house? How can you have the wolf writing legislation to protect the hens? I would contend we, the people, are the hens, and they are the predators. And this is capitalism as an economic system, of course, is almost anathema to environmental sustainability. It has as a system, as its DNA, as an internal engine, it has to loot and plunder. I mean, you might want to use more, softer language, euphemisms like develop and explore and those kinds of things. But as an economic system, it is dedicated to constant expansion. Constant expansion along the lines of this system will lead ultimately to planetary destruction. I know that sounds kind of dramatic, but I think the evidence is pointing in that direction. And we have a political class, with some slight differences. We have a one-party system, basically, in the country today. I think these calls for a third party are ill-placed. We really need a dynamic second party that is free from the dominant corporate forces which control the political system. Since the passing of the Supreme Court decision on Citizens United in January of 2010, we've seen a flood of corporate money now go into PACs at never before seen levels. Of course, you as individuals, you can contribute too. You could be just like Sheldon Adelson, the Las Vegas casino owner who is giving, he's boasting $100 million to his favorite candidate. So it's a level playing field. Sure, it's a level playing field. They're the elephants, and then they're the ants. So it's a level playing field. There's this guy in, I think he's in North Carolina, who says, one of these billionaires who's giving tons of money, here it is, there's a report from the Financial Times. Billionaire floods super PACs with funds. You've probably never heard of him, Harold Simmons. He said, I think the wealthy in this country actually have insufficient influence. That's a direct quote. And that's why he's giving more money, because rich people don't have enough influence in the political system. This is, again, it's beyond any kind of satire. I mean, how could Saturday Night Live do a skit on this? It won't be believed. From the boarded up storefronts to foreclosed homes, there are 12 million homes that have been lost since 2007, 2008, and 10 million today are underwater. That is to say, the value of the mortgage is less than the market value of their home. So we have all of these people who have lost their homes. We have tens of millions of people out of work. Many people who have simply dropped out of the job market because they've been so discouraged are not even counted. People have taken second and third jobs to make ends meet, or are working part-time but are considered full-time because they're working more than 24 hours a week. The actual unemployment figures are, of course, much larger than the official Department of Labor statistics. So there's an enormous amount of work to be done. I was recently in Spokane and also in the Idaho Panhandle, and there's a lot of train traffic there, and I could just see the dilapidated conditions of the tracks, of the stations, of the trains themselves. And then when you think about countries, like China, Japan, Korea, France, Germany, and you see the kind of vast rail system, you just have to wonder what are the priorities of the U.S. You have an environment here that badly needs to be attended to. There's a huge amount of work that needs to be done. There are all of these people out of work. And what is it about this economic system that cannot bring those two things together? I mean, it seems like a no-brainer. Lots of people out of work, lots of tasks to be performed. Why can't it be brought together? It can't be brought together because the profits are insufficient for the corporations who own the economy. So this is not something, again, that started in 2007 or 2008 or in the Roaring '20s or the Gilded Age. It goes right back to the founding of this country. And you have to understand that very basic fact. As Chomsky points out in this book that I have back there called How the World Works. James Madison, who was the principal writer of the Federalist Papers, he and Hamilton, and the principal writer of the Constitution and one of the President of the United States as well, he said the aim of government is to protect the opulent minority against the majority. Now, if that's not a definition of 1% versus the 99%, I don't know what is. That is the aim of government. And his colleague, John Jay, who was the first Supreme Court Justice, the first President of the Constitutional Congress, again, one of these, founding fathers, right? He said, those that own the country ought to govern it. Those that own the country ought to govern it. So the seeds of inequality are planted right at the founding of the Republic. And now the wedding of state and corporate power is at unprecedented levels. The implications for democracy are pretty ominous. FDR appointed Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court, and he was a very distinguished jurist. And he observed that you can have democracy in a society, or you can have extreme concentrations of wealth. You cannot have both. So we have seen the erosion of democracy during this incredible leap in inequality. And one of the things that, of course, the system is very skillful at doing in order to protect and preserve itself is deflecting attention and scrutiny. So we have a lot of focus on people like Bernie Madoff, right? I call him, he's a rotten apple. What a terrible man. He ripped off all of those widows. He took looted, philanthropies. Just an awful, awful person. And we can all beat our breasts and feel very virtuous, Put him into jail for the rest of his life. Then there's someone like Raj Rajaratnam, the head of the Galleon Fund in New York, who benefited from inside. It's a hedge fund. He got insider trading. He made tons of money. He's in jail. What a terrible man. Awful. His cohort, Rajat Gupta, is now being accused of participating in that. And on. Ken Lay, years have gone by, and people like that. So there's constant scrutiny of these rotten apples, but no attention paid to the barrel that produces the apples. The barrel is capitalism. These are extreme cases, let's say, of over-the-top excesses, but not out of the norm in terms of the predatory nature of this economic system. There was a very famous economist, you may have heard of him, Karl Marx. He talked about the voracious werewolf hunger of capitalism for profits. It will do anything to maximize gain. Destroy the environment? Hey, that's your problem. I got to make money now. There's a New Yorker cartoon, I think, that really exemplifies this kind of callousness toward nature. Here are our host, what Carl Sagan called this pale blue dot in the universe. This New Yorker cartoon, there's a CEO, there's a big stockholders meeting, and he's got all his pie charts and graphs up behind him, and people are clamoring in the audience, hey, what about our dividends? We want to hear, what's going on. And then he says to the assembled stockholders, while the long-term prospects for the planet are grim and gruesome, we're looking at widespread misery, hunger, famine, and wars and starvation. The short-term prospects for profits are rosy indeed. So I'm happy to announce to you today a new dividend. We are now exploiting the tar sands in northern Alberta. And with the passing of the XL pipeline, we'll bring those tar sands to the United States. That is typical of the attitude not just toward nature, which also has deep roots in capitalist thinking, that this is something out there to be exploited. It also has a theological root basis. If you go back to people like Winthrop, City on the Hill, John Winthrop, Francis Bacon, and others, you see this kind of Christianity being brought in as a justification for the exploitation of nature. That is to say, well, God wouldn't have created all of this bounty if he did not want us to, or she, to exploit it. So we have a God-given mandate to exploit nature. I mean, meanwhile, the planet is being destroyed. But this system cannot change its ways. You cannot change the leopard spots. This is a time when we have to act collectively. I know because of the propaganda around the Soviet Union, as soon as anyone hears collective, the next word they hear in their brain is Gulag and Stalin. Well, that's, again, the triumph of a great propaganda system. But just think about the environmental crisis, global warming. We just went in Colorado through the most brutal summer we've ever experienced, I've ever experienced. There was 65 days and counting. Today was, again, over 90, of over 90 and over 100 degree weather. We had forest fires in Colorado in March. It's unheard of. I mean, usually it's in end of summer during the dry season. But because there was so little snow this year, so little rain, you heard all about it. It made national news. There was one in Colorado Springs, one in the Fort Collins area, and in other parts of the West as well. Clearly, there is something happening with the climate. Now, can this climate change, can this be addressed by Bhutan, by itself? Even if it has the most enlightened leader, let's say, who is going to have zero carbon emissions, who's going to have, free bicycles provided by the state to all its citizens. Bhutan is a very small country. And all kinds of other facilities. Is that going to have an impact? Certainly the Bhutanese will feel good while I'm doing my part. We feel good here in the US with palliatives, with driving Priuses, I'm sorry to say, or recycling our paper, or plastic, or glass, and those kinds of things. I mean, I do those things too, but it's not really going to have, the kind of change that is required. The only thing that is going to affect and change the climate crisis that we are fast approaching is collective action. And that can't be done in a capitalist framework, because the capitalists are always looking to increase gain, to increase profits. We have to start looking, we have to come back from that way of thinking and see ourselves as very lucky to be on this earth, that has sustained us, but cannot continue to take the pounding and the pummeling that it has without it now erupting. And we see these eruptions in all kinds of ways with extreme climate. I was climbing in the Colorado Rockies last Sunday. You don't have to be a climate scientist. I could see with my bare eyes glaciers that were huge when I first moved to Colorado 35 years ago, who have not only shrunken, many of them in some instances have disappeared. So this is, an economic system that cannot change its spots. We have to change it. How can that be done? And that's, I think, one of the, interesting aspects of the book. There has been a huge increase in cooperatives of various sorts, food cooperatives, housing cooperatives. Again, if we had a real national media, you would know about this, what's going on in Boulder. People in Boulder will know what's going on in, let's say, San Rafael or Mendocino or Humboldt counties. There would be more information. There's been, the going local in terms of food is a very powerful movement. There's been a huge amount of monies transferred from these big four banks that I mentioned earlier to local credit unions. So at least your money stays in your community. I mean, these are initial steps toward formulating some kind of alternative system. And I think it's the problems with capitalism are systemic. They are structural. It's these cosmetic changes that are being proposed. A little rouge here, a little eye, blusher here, a little eye makeup there. The corpse is basically in the ICU. It barely has a pulse. And so adding these cosmetics is not going to bring that corpse back to life. Maybe it will extend its life by a few more years, but it's not going to be resuscitating in the ways that are required. So fundamental change is necessary to avoid future collapses. It's long past time to examine capitalism itself. And I think this book really provides, asks a lot of the questions, some of which I've put out to you this evening, and provides answers. Like JP Morgan Chase, like Bank of America. So there is a kind of weird, really existing capitalism here in the US, not this kind of mystical thing of the invisible hand. When people quote Adam Smith, who have never read Wealth of Nations, who was in fact very critical of the rapacious nature of the merchants of the day, as he called them, in England, and he was particularly critical of the British looting of the Indian subcontinent, and wrote about it very, very eloquently. Now this crisis begins, this current economic phase of capitalism, really begins, as Wolff points out, in the 70s and 80s. What happens in the 70s and 80s? Wages go stagnant. And so there was a huge political attack on unions, and it's been very successful, sadly. At one point, union membership in this country, private sector, it's in the single digits. And in the public sector, it's just a little bit beyond 10 or 11%. That's had a profound impact on everyone. Maybe a few Silicon Valley gazillionaires aside, Facebook and Microsoft and those things, but that's not a steady decrease in wages. So the corporations and the banks figure out, okay, you don't have much money, but why don't I make credit cards available to you? Free and easy. And there wasn't a day, I don't know if you remember at that time, offering, free credit, just sign up. I don't have any money. I mean, I don't even have a job. It doesn't matter. Just sign, you can have a credit card. I think it's important and absolutely critical to talk about the root causes of the economic crisis, which began in 2007, 2008. Why is that important? I think it should be obvious, but I'll say it. Because if we don't identify the primary cause, then all of the solutions that are being proposed will be for naught. They will not be effective because we have not identified the problem. We'll believe, in fact, we're solving the problem when we're not even addressing it. And then we'll offer great proposals when in reality we're not even close. And that system, of course, is really existing capitalism, not the capitalism taught in economics departments or the capitalism that is described on the evening news or on Morning Edition or All Things Considered or the Charlie Rose Hour or the News Hour on PBS. That kind of capitalism is a fantasy. What we have today is state capitalism where corporations are heavily subsidized and supported by the state. There's a word for that. It's a kind of perverted socialism. So we saw that, of course, when different corporations are going under the state. That means us, we the taxpayers, like Goldman Sachs, like Bear Stearns, like Citicorp, like Wells Fargo. For the first time since 1820, basically, wages of American workers were on a steady increase. In the mid-70s and late 70s and certainly in the 80s, wages go flat. Corporations discover a couple of things. With their political allies in Washington, they can smash the unions. The union movement has always been a thorn in the side of capitalism. Why? Because workers are organized and make demands for better working conditions, for better pay, for to have a decent life, to have such things. Maybe some of you have heard of them if you're old enough: pensions, health care. No, nobody's old enough here. Paid vacations, paid sick leave, things like that. Are all now increasingly distant memories.